Welcome to the Musicians That Matter, interviews with the musicians that matter on Rowan Radio 89.7 WGLS FM. Our special guest today is none other than bassist extraordinaire and songwriter Chris Squire of the band Yes. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, nice to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure indeed. It's always a pleasure. I've been a fan of Yes for the last 40 years in its various incarnations and things, and we were hoping to talk a little bit about how you came to the band and what have you. When you grew up in England, what were your musical tastes when you were young, and why did you decide to take up the bass?
I guess I wasn't really a rock and roll fan in the genre of Elvis Presley, or that was just before my interest took place, which naturally happened, in 1963 when I was 15, and the Beatles broke out, and really that got my attention, and I thought, that looks like a good job. I might want to do that. So, and so that's really prior to that. My background had been in in the English church, actually in church music, and I've been in a couple of cathedral choirs, and so that I knew all of that. Side of life, really, and now, as I said, when I was 15, and the Beatles came about, and then, by the time I was 17, I was a huge Who fan, because they were sort of a local band to my area of northwest London, where I lived, and I used to go and religiously watch the Who once a week, somewhere or other. So that was really my roots, and of course the Stones and a little bit later on Cream. All those people were big influences on me.
Yardbirds and the like as well.
Yardbirds, yeah, I like the Yardbirds as well. Yeah, I mean, I had as far as blues was concerned, I played catch up really with all of that, and got to. I went back and learned about some of the great blues artists, but that was because there was a big R&B sort of phase at that time, in the mid '60s in England, and of course also a lot of the English bands then were sort of very influenced by Tamla Motown as well, and I used to like a lot of that, and. I remember going around to a friend of mine's house and listening to, a lot of Motown records, and, I found them really interesting.
Wow, I see.
Got to like a lot of that.
And you had spoken about the Who and seeing them weekly somewhere in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Was it John Entwistle that inspired you to pick up the bass? Why the bass?
No, I actually, the reason why I picked up the bass actually was because... when I first, probably when I was 15 again at school, a buddy of mine there had classical guitar lessons from a young age, so he was actually a real good guitar player, and he also discovered, rock and roll at the same time as I did, and so we decided to, put a band together. And he simply said to me, well, listen, you're tall and you've got big hands, you should play bass. And I went, okay, I'll go and buy bass.
Just that simple.
Yeah, that simple, yeah.
Wow. Well, you certainly do have big, talented hands that, I didn't know if it was that you had trouble playing the guitar because of the way your fingers were.
No, I tried playing guitar a little bit. In those formative years, and I don't think I did a very good job of it somehow or other. I tried to sort of do some Townsend stuff, but it wasn't really me.
Right.
So I reverted to the bass.
Right. Well, and again, being a Yes aficionado, in doing research, you had started a band called The Selves, and eventually The Sin.
Yeah.
Right. how did all that come about, and how did you move
well,
from
once again, that
to
was,
Yes?
I believe, John Wheatley, who was the guitarist I was talking about, my buddy at school. I had a band with him, and then there was also the Selfs that I started with Andrew Jackman, who was just a neighbor of mine, and his father actually was in the London Symphony Orchestra, so he had a whole musical background in his household.
Right. I wanted to find out, you had played a bit with the Selfs and the Sin, and then did you form Mabel Greer's tour shop?
Toy shop, yeah.
Right. I'm sorry, I thought I said that.
The Selfs, was. I was going to finish saying that that was with Andrew Jackman, who later went on. He was the keyboard player in the Selfs and in the Sin, and then later on did the musical orchestral arrangements on Fish Out of Water and on some Yes tracks as well. He did orchestral arrangements over the years, so he was a big influence on my musical beginnings as well. I used to go around to his house. He had a piano, and I'd sit there with my bass and sort of learn what bass parts were, as regards the chords and stuff like that. So he was a great friend and a great teacher. He's no longer with us, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry.
Had a brain aneurysm suddenly and died. But so I doubt I will ever do another Fish Out of Water album, because he was an integral part of that as well.
Right. But
so
with Mabel Greer's toy
Mabel
shop.
Greer's toy shop was an experiment, and we were very much in the summer of love, and 68 or something, or 67, 68, and we were playing at the psychedelic clubs and taking acid and having a good time, really. But,
well, is that when you met John
Anderson? It was
Anderson?
a bit of a dirgy kind of group, actually.
Right.
We used to do like a 25-minute version of Light My Fire,
wow.
which just went on and on, endless guitar solos.
Right. Well, at what point did you meet John and kind of pull Peter into it and kind of make it Mabel Greer's Toy Shop and then change the name to Yes?
Well, John, that's around the time I met John, when I was playing with Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. And in an odd way, John kind of actually joined Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. And we did a couple of shows with John in the band. And then I think that something happened with the drummer, and he moved or went away or did something. And so that kind of Mabel Greer's Toy Shop sort of like just came to an end. And then John and I decided that we would, carry on together. And Clive Bailey, who was the guitar player in Mabel Greer's Toy Shop, also was sort of, on the periphery as well. And a song that I wrote with Clive Bailey, Beyond and Before, is actually on the first Yes album.
Right.
And but then he went off to do something else too. So that's when we recruited Peter Banks, who I had played with in the Sin, and I knew Tony Kaye just as a guy around town who I knew played keyboards, and he'd been in a couple of bands I'd known about, who were startup bands, and I liked his playing. And then Bill Bruford came along. He just advertised in the Melody Maker magazine, I think, and
wow.
He either answered the ad or he had an ad in there, drummer requires band or something,
Right.
So that's how we got Bill.
So, right, and we had interviewed John, actually, not too long ago, and he had said that when he had joined with you and met you around the time of the Marquee Club, where everything was hot and interesting and all the music was fabulous, he had said that he thought that Mabel Greer's Toy Shop was just too long a name, and he said that's why you went with Yes. But is there another story that you have?
Yeah, no, I don't think that. I don't think we wanted to carry on as Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. I mean, that was such the kind of name that was rooted in the acid roots, if you like, of bands of that time who were in the psychedelic kind of movement, all had names a bit like that, So, in actual fact, I remember when Peter Banks was in this meeting when we were trying to think of the name for the band, and my suggestion was to call the band World, and Peter Banks actually came up with Yes.
Wow.
As far as I remember, and we liked that, and so we went with Yes.
Great, great. And so you came together and you made the first album at that point. And how were you doing at that point?
How were we doing?
Right. What had changed for you? I guess you had gotten a contract, you'd been heard, and you were able to pull together an album.
We got some a couple of agents to represent us to do shows, and and we played at the Marquee Club, which was the best known club really in London, and they liked us there, and they booked us to play there. I'd already played there quite a bit with the Sin, my previous band. That's when the famous night when we actually opened for Jimi Hendrix.
Wow.
First ever show, and we were the opening act for that. So that was a memorable night. So I had experience of playing at the Marquee Club with the Sin, and so I guess we talked to the people there who ran the place, and Yes got a regular spot at the Marquee Club as well, and we sort of became more and more popular there, until we were like, the headline act, every once a week, I think, pretty much.
In 1969, you guys had gotten a gig with Atlantic Records to produce your first album, eponymously named Yes, and two singles from it that were actually covers was Every Little Thing by the Beatles and I See You by the Byrds, and you did some of your own compositions as well on the album. And the interesting thing I found was melody maker, columnist Tony Wilson had chose Yes and Led Zeppelin as the two bands most likely to succeed that year. How about it?
Yeah, that's funny that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you moved forward a little bit, and then you got together and you created Time in a Word. And although Steve Howe appears on the cover, he didn't actually play because the Yes revolving door for members was just beginning.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, well, when Steve came on board, we hadn't released that album yet, and so we did a photo session for the band with Steve, and back in those days, I think it was just a mix-up at the record company. They didn't realize that actually it was Peter Banks playing on that album. So we always look back on that with a kind of a smile, that it was just a kind of a typo, really.
Yeah, well, it was a fabulous album, and there were a few covers on it and some original material, like Then and Sweet Dreams were An Astral Traveler, and of course Time in a Word, the title track, which I guess was one of John Anderson's kind of strum and sing sort of things. But you guys did a lot of singing together as far as the band went.
Yes, we did. One of the blueprints that we for the band, the blueprint, I guess, for the band when we first started. John and I both really had a lot of affection for classical music and also for like Simon and Garfunkel and other harmony bands like the what were they called?
A cappella bands.
No, the band that we actually did a couple of tracks early on that never appeared on a Yes album, but who wrote those? What am I thinking? I just can't remember their name. They were a big American harmony band. Oh, Fifth Dimension?
Fifth Dimension, yeah, Fifth Dimension.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and as soon as we started writing together, John and I, it was to have vocals and harmonies, and and also we wanted to make sure that the players in the band, were good players as well. So we wanted a good instrumental band coupled with a strong vocal presence.
Right, right, certainly. And the first two albums were excellent, and then within 2 years, you came out with a third album, the Yes album. It was called Autumn 1970, with your famous longtime producer Eddie Offord.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite albums of all times. It's just totally compelling, each song.
Yes, well, we still feature, I don't know, 2 or 3, maybe 4 of those songs. We still do as part of our live show. So yes, it definitely had a lasting effect. I mean, we've got a single Good People, which not many people know actually is after Owner of a Lonely Heart. It's the most played airplay track of our history, and third is Roundabout.
I see.
Which of course is from Fragile, but from the Yes album, we still play Yours Is No Disgrace and I've Seen the Good People and
Starship Trooper. Sure.
And that album is always very well represented still.
And by that time,
and it was a magic time for us because that was our breakthrough album, and it went to #1 in the British charts, and obviously that had a knock-on effect in the U.S. because of that, and started our career over here, really.
Certainly. The your bass sound was kind of fairly well defined for that album. It was kind of a big Rickenbacker growling sort of sound. How did you, were there things that you did to get a certain sound?
Well, I played a certain way, and then, of course, when I met Eddie Offord, who coincidentally was the engineer on Time and the Word as well. Mm-hmm. And we had a producer on that album, Tony Colton, and one of the odd things that happened there was that Tony Colton wanted to mix A Time and a Word on headphones, because that was like in that era when everyone was like listening to Blood, Sweat and Tears on headphones and digging the stereo panning and things like that. So he decided to mix the album on headphones, but the headphone output on this desk that they had in the studio there, which had been put together by a bunch of engineers in a very ramshackle sort of way, didn't have any bass on the headphone output somehow. It was like a really tinny sound. So he had these headphones jammed on his head while he was mixing the album, and he kept saying to Eddie Offord, turn the bass up, turn the bass up.
Wow.
And so, of course, there was a couple of speakers in the back of the mixing room that were, where we could also hear what was going on. And that was when Steve Howe came into the band. Although he hadn't played on the album, he was sitting next to me while this producer was mixing it with Tony Colton and Eddie Offord. And I always remember Steve Howe turned to me and said, the bass is really loud, isn't it? And I said, oh, yeah, he's the producer. You better ask him.
Yeah, there you go.
Of course, I was happy that the bass was really loud.
Right.
But it didn't sound as loud in the headphones that the guy was mixing. But he insisted that that's the way it should be.
Interesting.
So in a way, I owe a lot to Tony Colton.
Yeah.
Making me heard.
Right. Yeah. No doubt about it. That big, loud, bass growling melodic sound that you have, and then I guess the Yes revolving door shifted again, and Tony Kaye, did he leave the band, and then Rick Wakeman come in?
We did a U.S. tour, and I don't know that there was some. I didn't have a problem with Tony. Tony was a bit of a ladies' man, but liked to have fun on the road, and I think he shared a room back in those early days. You know, like in the first touring days, I used to share with Bill Bruford and
Right.
Tony Kaye and Steve Howe shared a room, but I don't think Steve appreciated some of the company that was endlessly in Tony's other bed already in.
Right.
So that produced a bit of a riff between Tony and Steve, and at the end of that tour, I could tell that there wasn't, the band wasn't really hanging together like it should. And, and then I noticed that Rick was having a lot of success, and I thought, well, why not, see if he wants to join us, because, he's getting a lot of front page headline news about what a great keyboard player he is, and also he was, of course, playing on Cat Stevens' Morning is Broken, and he played on David Bowie's Major Tom on the Mellotron. So Rick was ahead of the game.
Right.
But when I met Rick, he was doing I think about 7 or 8 sessions a day for other people.
Wow.
He was like he used to get about 6 hours sleep a night, I think, and he was so busy.
Wow.
So in a way, and he used to smoke about 80 cigarettes a day. He'd never see him without a cigarette.
Wow.
But, so I think it may have been a relief for Rick to actually join the band and give up that session career.
Right. So he
which would have killed him, but I think, if he'd carried on with that schedule. But
right.
So he came in, and of course then we had, a bunch of really good people playing together, and Steve and Rick, of course, were both excellent at what they did, and and Bill and I had gotten a good relationship, and everything was going along well,
Right, and then you had Fragile, Close to the Edge, and Topographic Oceans, which were kind of all in the long, sweet-like composition direction.
Yeah, well, the Close to the Edge was the first, one side of the vinyl track we did, and that worked very well, and and then we went on and did Topographic Oceans. Of course, after Close to the Edge, Bill decided to go and play with King Crimson, which was a bit of a shock, actually, to me, that he wanted to do that. But he, at that time, he felt that that the songwriting was going in a different direction from the kind of music he wanted to play. And he felt he'd be more at home playing the more jazzier style that King Crimson had, and so off he went with Mr. Fripp.
Well, King Crimson had the revolving door,
White,
too.
Of course, who was a totally different drummer from Bill. I mean, you couldn't be any more different, really. And so, of course, I had to make a big adjustment from a drummer who had a certain style to another drummer who had a completely different style of playing, and that took a little while to figure that out. And of course, it took a while for Alan White to play some of the Yes music up until that point, because Alan had come from playing with John Lennon and a much more simple feel type player than Bill, and then of course he found himself having to play live all this Bill Bruford jazzy stuff, and so there was an adjustment period there. But of course, eventually we settled down into our new home, as it were, and of course I've been playing with Alan ever since, and he's been great.
Right, and the project rather, White Fish.
Yeah.
And tell us about Fish. Speaking of Fish, you had done, I think it was 74 when you did Fish Out of Water, which was your main solo album at the time. Tell us a little bit about how the name Fish came about. There's several stories you read on the internet.
Talking of Bill Bruford, it was he nicknamed me, once again harking back to that sharing, being two to a hotel room in the early days, and and I am a Pisces, but Bill came up with the name because he used to think I spent an inordinately long amount of time in the shower, and there was one very memorable time in Norway. Because I always like to do a lot of thinking in the shower. It was always just a habit of mine. And once we were in Norway, and I remember that the whole room got flooded.
Nice.
And the water went out into the corridor of the hotel.
Nice.
It's quite fun. So that's why Bill started calling me Fish.
Got it.
And it stuck.
I see. So then you went through Relayer, which was jazz, Going for the One, and Tormato, which were rock and roll. And then Drama was a big time of change where the keyboardists changed again.
Yeah, exactly. At that time, you're actually skipping over the period with Relayer where Patrick Moraz was the keyboard.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was an interesting time. It was a big time when jazz rock was, making a big impact on music at that time, and with the face of Return to Forever and and other band, John McLaughlin, all those people. McLaughlin, that's how you say it, I think. We regularly play with those bands. So a lot of that was rubbed off onto the Relayer album, and especially with Patrick coming from that style of playing as well. And then, of course, we came to do Going for the One, which we thought we were going to carry on with Patrick, but once again, I don't know, there was, I think, some kind of rift between Steve and Patrick.
Oh, no.
But I'm not quite sure why there was. But so Rick came back in, and and Going for the One was ended up being one of the good albums, and
sure, absolutely.
And then we went on to do Tomato after that, I guess.
Right, and that was the John Anderson "Don't Kill the Whale" period, I guess.
Don't Kill the Whale.
Yeah, was it Rick Wakeman who said that about John Anderson that nobody cares more for the planet Earth but doesn't live on it than John Anderson?
That sounds like Rick.
Yeah. What was your feeling about collaborating?
I've never actually heard that quote before, but that definitely sounds like him.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've had the privilege of speaking with him as well, and it's been a lot of fun. But what was it like to work with John Anderson for so long?
Well, we had our ups and downs, but not anything other than just the natural form of competition and wanting to get the best out of the band, and we wouldn't always agree, but. He had his ideas about how much echo should be on things, which I always thought was way too much. And then, but we'd always compromise, at the end of the day, in one way or another. And, I really had, learned a lot from that man, is all I can say. Having worked with him all that time, he's very talented, very innovative, and has a definitely a natural knack for composition and music.
Fabulous. So Drama had come about, and again the keyboardist changed, and the singer had changed. Even John was off doing some other projects, and it was except for your bass, which I get, and your voice, which was the carrier of the Yes sound through Drama, it was very electronic.
Do you think the Drama album seemed electronic?
Well, no, I just kind of mean there was a big sort of keyboard sort of emphasis to Drama. It was a very big sort of sound, and I mean, I think it was kind of like almost the pre-Asia sound that Steve Howe kind of took with him, and when he used the
Well, I think what we were really saying is that Jeff Downs came in, and
right.
of course Jeff and Trevor Horn were in the Buggles, and they were basically a techno pop act,
right?
You know, and so yeah, of course, so Jeff brought with him that techno keyboard kind of thing, which was kind of a different approach to Wakeman. Of course, we started with Rick with the synths and all that, but Jeff was more of the techno kind of German even kind of inputs that came in as well. Like Kraftwerk kind of
right
element, So that's what you found on drama. And I thought the marriage was great. I mean, I think people thought I was mad when I said that the Buggles were going to be coming in to replace John and Rick. But both Trevor and Jeff had, although they were the most successful pop act in the world at that time, with Video Killed the Radio Star, they were both dyed-in-the-wool Yes fans. So it was kind of like, it was actually a marriage made in heaven. And I think to this day, the drama album stands out as being a very, very good album.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, Machine Messiah all the way through to Tempest Fugit, which has a very, very strong bass to it. Apparently, the headphones didn't work well in that studio either, and they kept turning up the bass,
Yeah, no. Well, that was Eddie was still involved actually with that album. Eddie came back in to work with us on that, and we hadn't worked with him for a couple of years, and it was quite, I mean, there are some funny stories that go along with the return of Eddie, but I don't have the time to tell you now, but he didn't actually finish mixing the album. We ended up mixing it at Psalm Studios, which was Trevor's wife's studio, actually.
Wow.
In East London, East End of London. So, but that's where they made all the tracks for the Buggles album and Video Killed the Radio Star. So it was a good place to work, and Eddie had got out of control a little bit, and we had to let him go at that point.
Well, he had served you fabulously until that point. And I
know. I mean, Eddie is one of the greatest soundmen of all time, and I haven't been in touch with him at all recently, and I don't know what he's doing, but I think he mainly was interested in being a sailor.
Right.
He loved boats and things.
Wow. Well, and why would Steve Howe and Jeff Downs leave such a successful band making good music?
Well, that's a very good question. I didn't understand it. But what actually happened, though, was that we had a split as regarding our management at that time. And what happened was that Trevor Horn and myself and Alan White didn't want to continue with the same management, but Steve and Jeff weren't as sure about that as we were. So that's kind of how, at that time, everything just disintegrated. And then Steve and Jeff went back with the manager and said, "Well, let's do another project," and that's where Asia came from.
Right, and they and at that point, you and had gotten together with some of the remaining band members, Sans John, and came up with, I guess, the Cinema Project that wound up becoming Yes Again?
Prior to that, Alan White and I were making demos with Jimmy Page, because that was the point was Robert Plant was supposed to come along, and the infamous XYZ project was supposed to take flight, but that didn't happen because Robert felt it was too early after John Bonham had died to do something like that, and so the momentum on that sort of died down, and that's when we got together with Trevor Rabin and Alan and I, and we started to look at, the cinema project it was going to be. That was the name it went under, and it wasn't going to be Yes. It was going to be cinema, and we started in my studio, in my house, doing demos for everything, and then I brought Tony Kaye back in as the keyboard player, because I realized that Tony, more of a feel, simple keyboard player as opposed to the flamboyance of Rick, would suit Trevor Rabin style, because Trevor, being ultra technical on keyboards as well as guitar, would be a good fit. So Tony Kaye came back in, and we started to rehearse with that lineup, and then I brought Trevor Horn down to hear rehearsals, because he'd turned his attention to becoming a producer after the Yes breakup, and he was doing really, really well with a lot of different acts he was producing. So I wanted him to come and produce the cinema project. And that's how it started off. And we went in the studio and started to make, what was going to be 90125. And at a certain point, of course, Atlantic Records came down and heard it and loved what we were doing. But, there was always that nagging thing that Phil Carson, who was the English sort of like, CEO of Atlantic or whatever, or international head of Atlantic, he kept saying, why don't you get John back? It'd be so. And I said, no, I know, we're doing this cinema thing. And he kept saying to me, but it'd be great if you got John back, So eventually I said, okay, look, I'll go around and see him and play him what we've got and see if he even likes it. And I did, and in fact, John really liked it and said he'd like to be back in. So therefore, that's why he came back in, and of course the people at Atlantic Records said, well, it's silly to call it cinema, isn't it? You might as well call it Yes again. So I said, yeah, I guess you're right.
Right.
And that's how that happened, really.
Well, not to skip details, but unfortunately limited by time, I could talk to you and listen to you about Yes for hours, perhaps days. Maybe you can sum it up and just tell us what you're doing now, and we could talk about the tour, maybe?
Well, there's an upcoming Yes tour. This summer we're going to be going around the States, and it's really, we were on tour last year with Styx, and we didn't really have a long enough set to promote as much of the Fly From Here album as we wanted to. So we're going to be doing a lot more from that album on this tour. And, of course, I'm delighted to say that, we have our new singer, John Davison, who is a gem. And, I'm really proud to present him to the Yes fans as our new singer, because he's really talented. And apart from that, for the last couple of weeks, has been the release of my album with Steve Hackett, the Squacket Project.
Right.
Are you aware of that?
I am. I have one on order with Steve Hackett's autograph, and hopefully you'll be kind enough to autograph the other half.
You're making money on the side by doing a signed autograph.
No, hardly. I would not part with them.
The record I only received any copies from the record company yesterday.
Wow.
So he's ahead of the game on that. But we're both very proud of the Squacket album, and the reviews and the acceptance of the album have been fantastic. So I'm very happy about that, and we're hoping maybe to do some live Squacket stuff in the fall, which will probably be in Europe, but we haven't made any definite decisions as yet.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris, for spending time with us, and thanks to your wife, Scotty, for facilitating the interview and just being a general a great gal and helping the world appreciate your music and what have you.
Okay, thank you.